Okay, this panel is called Will COVID and Digital Identity Destroy Personal Privacy? COVID has accelerated the digitization of our work and our personal lives. It's also encouraged a culture of tracking and tracing every single individual as they go about their daily lives. So what are the impacts to our personal privacy? Is it positive in general for society? Where's this going? And how might the idea of self-sovereign identity help to achieve multiple goals that appear on the face of it contradictory? I'm Anthony Lewis, Associate Director at Temasek, and I sit in the blockchain team. With me, I have panelists Carol Fowler, CEO of Transmute, Claire Barber, CEO of Matter, and Glenn Gore, CEO of Finity. Carol, Transmute is the verifiable data platform for global trade. Matter is a standards-based organization delivering infrastructure to support verifiable data and digital trust. And Affinity is building trusted digital identities and credentials. Your identity, your world. So let's start with COVID. COVID has undoubtedly impacted everyone to some degree or other. Okay, so I just want to be a bit sensitive here as we discuss the implications of some of the technologies that are being brought to save lives. Okay, so there's a trade-off here, of course, and I love trade-offs. So let's kick it off with a question. I can't, personally here in Singapore, I can't leave my house without signing in and being tracked. I've got various apps, devices, every shop I go into, I have to scan QR codes. On the upside, I'm getting pretty good at scanning QR codes, but it does feel oppressive, okay? So to the panelists, whoever wants to start, how do you feel about being the enablers of this kind of oppressive technology?
Well, maybe I'll start. I'd challenge you on the oppressive, and let's talk a little bit about that. But first of all, let's talk about what a strange year that it's been. I don't think that any of us would question the idea that we've seen some really big changes in our lives, and we've seen all of those changes kind of compound as stresses that kind of affect how we think about the world around us and our day-to-day lives. And I think it is fair to say that, many people have lost loved ones and have been significantly adversely impacted by this pandemic. And we are the privileged ones that are sitting here in good health and with the ability to have this conversation. So our thoughts should be with those who've been deeply affected. But I think we've heard a lot about the inconvenience of contact tracing and tracking. I happen to live in New Zealand. We're a really lucky country, and that luck came from a very hard lockdown early on, and a lot of work to put in a contact tracing system that is a combination of people's behaviours, like using contact tracing apps to scan into places, and also interviewing people who are testing positive as they test positive to COVID, and being able to rapidly sort of trace those people. And I would say from our perspective living here, that the freedoms that we have to move around easily, not to wear masks in public, to be able, the only places we are mandated to wear masks is on a plane or on a bus or a train, public transport. The freedoms that we have to engage in our day-to-day lives far outweighs the inconvenience of scanning to enter a business premises or a situation like that. But we're also very privileged here in that we live in a world where we have a Privacy Act, where the rules of the society say that privacy is an important thing and that it must be respected. So we can have a reasonably high degree of confidence that the data that is gathered through the app tracking process, even where that data is off device and outside of the control of the individual, that's going to be used in an appropriate way. And if it wasn't approved in an appropriate way, that there would be consequences for that inappropriate usage, and that there would be some level of recourse. And I think what we forget here is that these issues aren't technology issues per se. They're a combination of societal rules and technology that enables different possibilities. And we should always continue to think about those things in that context. And I would argue, perhaps, that I'm really pleased to see the privacy debate has surfaced through the use of contact tracing and brought it into mainstream conversation, because my first challenge to anyone who feels like contact tracing has been invasive is that, what do you think was happening to your privacy every time you were using the internet before? I think, how many apps were you using on your phone where you had enabled tracking through map functionality or location-based functionality? And how clear were you about where your data was going to, who was getting to use it, and for what purposes on the internet of today? So I like the amplification of the conversation. I think this is a combination of, societal rules and technology, and it's great to actually have the privacy agenda on the table.
Fantastic, thank you, I agree, and I love that. So that last, I think we all agree that I think deep down we're all privacy nerds, given the industry that we're working for, and we're all glad that suddenly people are taking this seriously. I want to pick up on that last point you made though about the apps. And we all have lots of apps on our phone that are tracking us to various degrees. I think many of us have come across the story where you're talking about something over dinner, and then Facebook suddenly shows you ads for that very thing you're talking about. How creepy does that sound, right? But a lot of the apps we were using, we consented to using, and whether we knew it or not, we knew we were making a trade-off. We knew we were the product. Over the past few years, if it's free, you're the product. However, with contact tracing, it's something that's almost being forced upon us. It's the other way around. So does someone want to react to that?
I would disagree with that, Anthony. I actually think the vast majority of customers using some of the big data providers had no idea what they were giving up. No idea at all. There's one thing and you got to remember, we work in this industry, and we are able to understand the value of data and how AI and ML can work. And even for a lot of us, we don't truly understand just how invasive some of this data is and the insights they can draw upon that. So I would kind of disagree and say I think people are still incredibly naive about what is being tracked, how much of it is being tracked, who has access to it, how is it being used, how is it being shared across third parties. I think there's great examples of driving this awareness. I think about, if you haven't watched the documentary Social Dilemma, I think they did an excellent job of just highlighting, and the feedback when I talked to people about that was they had no idea about it, just zero, and that for the first time kind of felt that they had been violated in terms of what people had on them. So I think 2020 in some ways is proving to be a year of catalyst on many fronts. It's driving disruptive innovation in many different ways, and one of them will be privacy and identity, and that is a good thing. But I think you have to be very careful about the unintended consequences of it. And I just want to pick up on what Claire was saying, because I've been in the unique space where in the last month I was based in the US, and I saw one extreme of how a country deals with it, and now I am in Singapore, and I think at the other extreme of it, and I don't feel it's invasive at all. I think you have to understand there's a balance between what are the rights of an individual and what are the rights of a society, and that you do have to live alongside other people, and you have to be responsible in some of these things. And I think having contact tracing, if that allows us to open up communities and allow people who are most at risk to interact, you think about the impact this has had on children who couldn't go to schools and couldn't build social bonding at an incredibly important part in their life, or the elderly who have been incredibly isolated at this. If this is the small piece of technology that allows us to fast track that, because again, if you look at January, February, March, depending where you are in the world, you can enable lockdowns literally within 24 hours. And we saw that where 70% of the world's population was isolated. What we're seeing, though, is it's not a simple flick of the switch to turn it back on again. And I think we do need technology and tools that are incredibly powerful, but we should also be having some open dialogue around what exactly these tools enable and what does it mean after this. I think that's really the big question I'm interested in is how long are we going to be in this state? Like, how do you know when it's safe to turn these off again? And I think that's a question that's, maybe it's too early to ask, but I think we should be thinking about that.
Thanks, Glenn. And before coming back to unintended consequences, because I think there's a lot to explore there. We've talked a lot about personal privacy. Let's zoom out a little bit and talk about companies, corporates, how they're reacting to all of this when it comes to international trade. So I think that's for you, Carol. How do you think about this, given your expertise?
Yeah, thank you. And real quick, just to draw a little bit on what Glenn and Claire were noting, I'm based here in Austin, Texas, where the handling of contact tracing and in general, the sentiment, especially in Texas of all the 50 states, is one of kind of hyper individualism and a lot of care for personal right to privacy and ownership. But what's been really fascinating about that, and both several of my family members, including my parents, had COVID over the summer. And so I got to see firsthand how inefficient some of our contact tracing efforts have been, and how that has led to totally different kinds of problems. But I think it's opened the door for a discussion where I agree with Glenn. Most folks were not aware that they were being constantly kind of bonded by their data, so to speak. And this has opened the door for radically different conversations, at least in my sphere, around kind of acknowledging that tools like technologies, which are tools, can be used for good and evil. And we're often figuring both of those things out at the exact same time. And it's my opinion that the train has kind of left the station when it comes to applications that are collecting users' data. And so those of us on this call, I think, are working on technologies that rise to the occasion in terms of evolving the regulations that defend users' rights here, but also really surfacing accessible ways to exercise those rights. You mentioned, Anthony, that we consent to these applications, and that's true. But those of us in the space kind of deeply embedded know that the exercising rights after you've consented is nearly impossible. I always think of my grandmother when it comes to the accessibility of these things, and she, is on Facebook and the rest. And so I think this offers us an opportunity to examine the underlying incentives by situation for when data like this should be collected and how it should be used. And I think it opens the broader conversation of not just individual rights to privacy and ownership, but at least in my company's case, companies care about the same thing. And COVID has disrupted their workflows. We work in the supply chain space. It's no secret, and headlines every morning about just the unpredictability of supply and demand and the disruption in those spaces. I think the same technology that we're talking about here that enables easy exercise of ownership of your data and control of those rights can be extended to companies as well. And I think one of my kind of happy places, or where I think this is headed, is that this technology will not only kind of democratize the ability to access and exercise your right to ownership and privacy, but for companies, it'll allow easier lanes to build trust really rapidly on the global stage, and hopefully even democratize the access to these trading vectors for some of these smaller remote companies over time. And so I think we're kind of getting into some of the key takeaways in the half-year vision here. So I'll stop there.
I like happy. Carl, thanks for that. You mentioned a couple of times, you said this technology. I think I'm fairly familiar with the technology you're referring to. But if you want to have a crack at what self-sovereign identity, or what technologies you guys are using to try and solve for all of these different types of problems, then please go ahead. So mentally, we're moving away from apps that collect loads of data about you and can trace everywhere you're going. We're moving to another side, to another type of identity paradigm, if you want. So who's going to talk about this technology that I think you three have in common in your organizations?
Yeah, I think if I can just start by kind of contextualizing that the term self-sovereign identity is thrown around a lot, and now you're hearing me talk about a B2B SaaS solution for global trading manufacturers or manufacturers who are shipping across global borders. But what that term I think at least means to me is it kind of falls into a movement and then some technologies that power that movement. I would say the movement really has some incumbent values focused on privacy and enhanced ability to exercise ownership rights and better security. And these are more, I would say, philosophical ideas and values of a lot of the industry overall. And then there's some technologies like decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials and some other really cool stuff I know the others on the line can speak to that power applications that actually allow you to have better privacy and ownership.
Go on, someone speak. Someone fill in the gap. So I think that's thanks, Carol, for the high level overview. You mentioned the philosophical elements. We want to have privacy. We want to have control over our own data, whatever that means. So what is this technology that lets us do that, and how does it work to the layman?
Yeah, I don't think it is just one innovation here. It's a combination of innovations, and those innovations align to a set of principles, and those are the principles that Carol was talking about. I completely agree that I'm not even a big fan of calling it self-sovereign identity. I think it's a hugely inaccessible term, and one of the things that we have to do is make this language accessible to everyone. Most people think you're talking about the Queen if you talk about sovereign identity. They're sort of not really quite sure what it's got to do with them. But fundamentally, we're using decentralized mechanisms. So a concept that we're familiar with from the current world of technology is PKI, public key infrastructure. We're using decentralized PKI to allow people to remove the man in the middle, have things that should be discoverable about them if they're a public entity, discoverable by registering those things in a public way, and those things that you might want to retain as private, retained as private. We're talking about completely flipping on its head this idea of the things that connect us. So, for example, a telephone number or an email address can be taken away from you by the party that issues it to you in the first place. We're talking about technologies that would allow you to generate your own unique identifiers, your decentralized identities, and the idea that you might have a unique identifier for each relationship that you have, rather than one identifier that connects all of those relationships together through a single number, that if it's removed from you, you're kind of left with a bit of a problem. We're also talking about user-centric cryptography, and that's a big, long phrase, but cryptography that respects the individual in the equation. And a lot of the interactions that we have today, the individual is the last consideration in the equation. The man in the middle comes first, and that's something I think that's really important for us to solve for. And some of the work that Matt has been doing, we work in the standards community for a reason. I know Carol's company is very active. Affinity has also been doing some great open source work too. And the reason we do that is because we think that in the same way as we don't like the way that we have global giants today using people's data in all sorts of different ways, we need to ensure that no one party becomes the bad actor of the future, and that we have interoperability across the ecosystems so that we can be substituted out, and we can ensure that all of the control points of the infrastructure of the future are subject to choice, which is something that we don't have a lot of today. The other space that we work in technology-wise is actually this concept of linked data. So data itself has properties. We want to follow the semantic properties of that data. We want to be able to use its context, and we want to be able to use data cross-contextually. So those are really important properties, and we kind of have to take these technology concepts and translate those into experiences that people can actually recognize. And those have to be simple and easy to use so that we can be confident that we have audit trails around our interactions with others, that we are able to provide our consent in an informed way and withdraw it if we need to, and that we're actually able to use this in our day-to-day lives without thinking twice about it. So there's some pretty significant design challenges there as well. It's not just the technology, I think the technology bit and the standards piece we're really quite advanced in and we're doing very well on. I think it's the user design experience piece that we've got to work on to make sure that we get adoption. And what we know is that people value convenience over privacy and security every time they log on today. And that's the design challenge for all of us, to figure out how we achieve that convenience factor whilst preserving privacy and security, and do it at a cost that means that this technology is available to everyone, so that we're not leaving, key parts of the communities behind.
Cool, thank you. There are a number of things. Some of that went above my head. There are a number of things that really sang out to me, though. One was this idea that we do have different personas in different situations. Like, I'm a different person to my kids than I am to my wife, than I am to my colleagues, than I am down the pub, right? So we shouldn't want to, or we shouldn't be bringing every part of our personalities to every single situation. So I intuitively get that. And the other thing that you said that really rang out was the telephone number. So my telco can pull the rug and take my phone number back. And that was the phone number I was using for my one-time pins, my logins, my everything, all my chat rooms and everything. And that's kind of, I feel that some of those are part of my identity. And if they can rug pull me and just remove that, then what do I have left? What do I have that I can actually own and control? And I think that's what you're describing. There's something around user-centric cryptography that lets me create my own thing, which I own and manage and maintain, and people can't kind of rug pull me on that.
I think, and it's one step further than that, Anthony, too. Like, I want to be able to disclose only the information I want to disclose. And if I have a document today in a physical form and I share that with someone, they've got all of the information on that document. So if we're working in a digital world and we're redefining the paradigm, why not use a new set of tools that would enable you to selectively disclose and allow companies who want to respect people's privacy to adopt strategies of data minimization. I used to be the chief digital officer for a large telco in New Zealand, and I can guarantee you that there wasn't a day that I got out of bed in the morning and thought, I can't wait to have a data breach. It never was something that I contemplated in the morning. But data breaches happen even in the best run organizations because, there's bad actors there that can be extremely determined. So data minimization tools for enterprises and ways for them to do the things that they need to do business well for their customers and to meet the regulatory laws of the environments that they work in. But whilst being able to minimize what data they hold and take reduces the opportunity for those bad actors if there is a compromise or a breach. So those sorts of ideas, I think, are all part of the equation here.
Got it. Thank you. And Glenn, you're CEO of Affinity. I saw recently that one of the associated companies, Good Worker, just announced a deal with a famous Bollywood actor to help blue-collared workers in India get jobs. And I read something in there about selective disclosure. Can you bring this concept to life with applying these ideas to that particular example of someone who maybe is a seasonal worker who has lots of different jobs? What does selective disclosure and how does that all work using Claire's framework of the technology?
Yeah, Claire described it really well, and she kind of touched on this point, which is today you do not own your digital identity. You don't. And actually, your digital identity is incredibly fragmented. Lots of different organizations own different perspectives or different personas of you. Your e-commerce providers will own what your shopping habits are. Your telco will own who you talk to. Social media will know who you interface with, for example. There's actually no way to bring that together. And then If you think about,
I wouldn't want to bring it together. That's too scary that one organization would know all of those parts of my life.
yeah, that's the whole point. You don't want to bring it together from a third party. But for yourself, I hate it when I go to a new site and they know nothing about me and I'm starting from scratch every single time. I have to teach them what are my interests, what do I like, what do I don't want recommended. You know, it drives me nuts. I mean, we've all seen this, for example, you go to a site, you buy something, and for the next week, what do they advertise to you? They advertise to you exactly what you just bought. Why are you I already bought it, stop doing that. And that's because, you know, this identity is fragmented. And so if you apply many of the concepts that Carol and Claire were talking about, and then let's assign, you know, a real world problem where you have 400 workers who largely don't actually have any form of digital identity at all. You know, they actually, and in some cases, very hard to even prove any form of identity. No birth certificate, you know, they're coming from incredibly rural villages, they've migrated, they're starting from scratch. And so that presents a unique opportunity to, first of all, you have to kind of prove who are they and create a verifiable credential that says this person is who they say they are. And there's a lot of effort that happens behind the scenes to do that. There's a lot of, you know, verification, biometric data, for example. So let's create that and create a set of credentials for that. Then that person is going to say, okay, now that we know who they are, what are the skills that they have? And so as they prove the skills they have, this is another set of verifiable credentials. And we want to give that to the owner themselves. So they now have a way of digitally proving, I am who I am. These are the skills, and somebody else has verified that I have skills in this. And then over time, as they take jobs, we can give another set of verifiable credentials saying, okay, we know who Glenn is. We know that Glenn actually has skills as a sewing machine operator. And I can see that actually Glenn's been working for the last 1 year at you know, a mill, for example. And actually, let's get even deeper into that and let's get some feedback from the provider saying, was Glenn on time? Was he a good worker, for example? Now, if I have all of this as verifiable credentials and we play open standards framework where Claire and Carol and many others can kind of interact and swap these VCs, suddenly you've got this network effect coming in. And for example, digital banks may want to say, well, if you've already taken the work to prove who that person is and you're able to provide in a way that the user or the customer is able to identify who they are and what they want to share, they can share that they've had these skills, they've had work, and suddenly the risk profile for giving that person a loan, for example, is incredibly reduced. And the real world impact we saw during 2020, millions and millions of workers walking across India because they couldn't access funds because they couldn't prove who they were or that they were trusted that they had a job. And this is really what good worker is. And the fundamental difference here is that we're giving access to all of that information back into the hands of the worker, and they can take that to third parties. It's not just good worker that can do this. And as different partners bring different services into this, such as health services, insurance, finding that first housing for them as they move. I mean, imagine 18 years old, you've just come from rural, you've landed in Mumbai. Where do you even get started? And that is really the power of kind of decentralized identity services that have been talked about. It does change people's lives.
So thank you, Glenn. I think what you've described, and the reason I was looking over there was, I think you've described my important folder.
Yeah.
A digital version of my important folder. This is, where I store originals, on thick paper with color headings and things like that. All the original documents, somewhere in my filing cabinet. It's my thing. Now, if I have the digital
having just moved, here's mine in my bag, carrying it around with me as paper.
So if you have a digital version, no one trusts that because it's like anyone can doctor a digital version, right?
Well, they can't. This is again, Claire was touching upon this, kind of user-centric cryptographic end-to-end. And this is, start getting into some fascinating.
Yeah, historically, if I had if I had photos or a Word document, people can be like, oh, you typed that yourself. So
the inherent trust we have in a photocopy of a page is insane.
So what you're saying is this new technology will let me have a version of this, which I can prove I haven't tampered with this. It is genuine. It was issued by the university, the previous employer. And to Claire's point, I can selectively disclose, well, I want to show them my last salary, but I don't necessarily want to show them, 3 years ago, that time where I had an HR incident. Unless they ask, in which case.
But you can do much more. And this is the thing with digital. You can do things with digital credentials you cannot do in the real world. So you can do things like zero disclosure. You don't even have to show your academic record. You can just give a digital certificate that says somebody else will verify that you went to that school and agreed. You don't even have to show your academic record, for example, which is something that you just very, very, very difficult, if not impossible to do without using digital credential systems. You kind of have this binary approach. I either show you nothing or I'm showing you everything. And once I show you everything, I don't even know what you've done with it after the fact. Verifiable credentials, I can give you access to a subset. I can give you access to a proxy verifier who has said, hey, I've checked this. I can give you access for a period of time and revoke that access. So revocation of digital credentials is incredibly powerful.
So cool. Thanks, Glenn. And Carol, how does this, so I get it now for humans, how does it work for companies, and specifically, how does it help their global trade?
Yeah, so I think one thing that both Glenn and Claire were getting at when it comes to selective disclosure and this ability to choose how you're going to mix and match the kinds of credentials that you put in front of some sort of verifier, which would be very different for an employer as opposed to maybe getting a driver's license or getting into a bar, right? The lack of kind of duplication of this data is huge for companies. So something that we in particular see with our manufacturing customers is that they want data minimization. They don't want to be liable for data that is above and beyond what they actually need to do their business. At the same time, while they're looking for kind of the minimization of that liability and better efficiencies, they also want to protect the data they want to protect. And they today, a lot of times that means they have this data stored in different ways so that they issue what needs to be issued to a regulator or to maybe their customs broker. And that's going to look different than the data they're releasing to their end buyers, their other suppliers, tier 1 and 2 tier suppliers. And so I think similar to the individual example, companies care very deeply about reducing liability and minimizing that risk. They want the efficiency gains, but not at the expense of kind of giving away the whole ship. And so that's something that we've seen has been a tremendous driving factor in adoption of this technology. But then above that, something that we've seen in particular driven through the disruption of supply chains because of COVID is there's a broader benefit, which we haven't really figured out how to measure yet, which is what does it mean to have this level of integrity in your data set about your suppliers and about your products. When you can make faster decisions and more dynamic decisions, I always imagine kind of a supply chain that now looks like an octopus that can pivot based on what's going on in the world and what their suppliers kind of needs are, and the ability to rise to the occasion and meet the market at the right moment is something that I don't think we've ever seen before, and we're not sure how to measure, but companies are definitely leaning into that in their broader digitization strategy as a result of COVID.
I think there's some other things too, with that, Carol, as well. We're seeing more and more accountability, organizations being held to account for example, their impact on the environment. What are they doing around the carbon they're consuming? And consumers want to know what the footprint of these organizations are. Regulators want to know as well. So there's overlays of value that can be created at a data level by linking things across the supply chain that can allow people to prove extra contextual value or to prove that they've achieved some measure of assurance in the production of their goods and services that helps to create additional value in the eyes of the consumers or prove themselves to be regulatory compliant. So I think that there's so many opportunities as this technology continues to develop for us to look at how this can be used to serve whole new agendas.
Absolutely.
Wow, so it's not just about knowing your customer, knowing your supplier, that you're saying there's actual business that this stuff can help businesses make value-adding business decisions, strategic decisions. rather than just something annoying that they have to deal with to keep in regulatory compliance. For me, that's something I haven't thought so much about, because I've worked in finance. I've always thought of this as a regulatory compliance cost minimization or efficiency maximization type of technology, rather than something that can really enable my business to help make strategic decisions.
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
absolutely.
Oh, come on. So
I mean, yes, but it's about de-risking. I mean, if you look over, you want to be on the right side of history with this, right? And if you look back years ago when GDPR first came in, there was a mad scramble around the world. Obviously, everyone realized, one, incredibly good step forward in terms of the rights of an individual and privacy. Also, regulation with real teeth behind it. I mean, if you get caught in a disclosure there, material fines to an organization. And by the way, it doesn't matter if you're not in Europe, it's kind of global around. And then, in the last year, you've seen the California Privacy Rights Act again, which is moving forward. This is just the start. More and more governments around the world are going to continue to put more strict regulation, which increases the complexity of how you manage data, particularly around identities and privacy. And there is going to be a tipping point where it becomes too expensive and too complex. And these newer forms of technologies and business practices and the processes around it, I think will flip the management to the reverse of what it is today, where it will become too expensive to centralize it within these enterprises. And it will be more around, how do I de-risk myself in this? Because trying to that is going to become incredibly complex. And this is where, again, a lot of these technologies are looking way around the corner as to some of these future problems. And some of this is cutting new ground that's never been done before, but I think it's building a wonderful foundation for what the future, not only for us as individuals, but also for what best practice businesses and B2B will look like in the future.
Yeah, I'd just like to kind of build upon those themes a little bit more and talk a bit about brand integrity. And, there's a huge opportunity around shoring up the integrity of brands, whether that be in a data minimization strategy or by being able to prove that you have you've completed your farming in a catchment area where you haven't polluted the river. Or where you've achieved zero carbon emissions through your trade, all sorts of different ways. And I think, there's a moment in time opportunity here for countries to understand what this means for the brands of their countries as well. I was really proud to see New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile come together to create the DEPA agreement that was signed this year and is due for implementation next year, starting in February. This is the Digital Economy Partnering Agreement, where for the first time we've started to see 3 countries come together and talk about how would we mutually recognise each other's roots of trust as countries and ecosystems, and allow those things to form the basis of new opportunities for cross-border interactions and making things operate more easily. If you look at the level of, frankly, quite rubbish things we put up with today in terms of how we exchange stuff between countries, whether that be physical goods or even ourselves, the opportunity to think differently about those things and to recognize each other's roots of trust around different things so that we can understand what that data means cross-contextually and rely upon it across country borders is really, really important. And I think we will see more and more emphasis. I think the DEPA agreement is a really good starting point. And I think we'll see those topics come up at APEC this year around the digital economy as well. And I hope that we will see more and more recognition that it is not okay for governments to stand back and say, hands off, this looks too hard, we don't understand technology. That in actual fact, that digital infrastructure and the resilience of digital infrastructure and the ability to protect citizens and their rights through their use of that infrastructure is something that governments cannot be unopinionated about anymore, and then sit back and complain that they don't like the way the big tech giants are working. So, like, my challenge, I think, to all of us, and one of the things I personally like to stand up to is I think we have to help as the tech sector who are interested in the ethics of data and the way the internet manifests itself. It is our job to support our colleagues in the public sector in helping them to understand what the future could look like and what tools could be at their disposal in the future if they take that moment in time opportunity and step up to design things in. So I'm really excited, for example, here in the 2021 legislative calendar in New Zealand, we have a New Zealand Trust Framework piece of legislation coming up, which will set the rules of the road for the roots of trust that our country recognises and the principles that we think are important around privacy and a bunch of other things as well, and create the opportunity then for government itself to recognise itself, for public sector to recognise that it is itself a huge source of authoritative data about people and organisations that can be used in quite a different way to empower more economic value for the country and to uphold the rights of citizens. So I think that's really hopeful. And I think some of the work, like the deeper agreement, are the early shoots of hope that nation states are taking an interest in this.
Fantastic. I almost want to end there. But Claire, thank you very much. You touched on ethics in the future there. So why don't we round off? We started this conversation, which has been fascinating. We started off with COVID and does digital identity destroy personal privacy? Went through some philosophical commentary around where we are now and what we described the technology and what it's allowing us to be able to do in terms of the benefits that we previously thought were incompatible. But now we can do this and this and this, which we thought actually we had to pick. We thought there were trade-offs. So just very briefly, we will go around the table. What are the hairy issues and the roadmap challenges in your industry for the next 5 years? Just one or two sentences, and we'll go Glenn, Claire, and Carol.
One is how to make this. I think it was Claire that at the start talked about convenience, and I think the reality is it's still early days for this technology, and it's not as convenient as it should be in all of its use cases. So that's particularly a challenge. I think there's some big. The reality is this is going to have a huge impact as well on economics of how businesses monetize data, and I think. Thinking about how you do that in a way that respects the rights of an individual, but still allows for a lot of the functionality that we enjoy. Things like recommendation engines, which require vast amounts of data to feed them. But how do I know what it's doing with my data, for example? And so I think there's a lot of work there. I think there's a lot of work around the ecosystem and partnering. I think there's a lot of rapid experimentation going on. It's evolving quickly, and it's it's a double-edged sword in that a lot of this is based on true decentralized technologies. And the thing about true decentralized technologies is there's an implication that there is a bit of anarchy and chaos in those systems by design. And it's fascinating just seeing as you start building partnerships in this already, fears around, is someone else going to centralize this? Or how do I protect my business in this, which is kind of in a way, well, that kind of goes against true decentralization. So I think there's some interesting questions and issues as how that plays out. I think it will sort itself out. They're not insurmountable. And then as we solve this for ourselves, I think it's just going to be amazing to think about, can you apply this to non-human identities? Everything from animals. We saw the start of 2020 kicking off with incredibly bad bushfires in Australia, for example, which actually completely devastated some of the native animal populations. And you start thinking about, how do I reintroduce animals from different populations to increase DNA diversity? Well, that's a set of identity credentials. Can we use it to manage that? Can we apply it to robots and AIs, for example, as we want to track them and think about, does a robot need its own identity? And there's some early signs that yes, they do. So I can't wait to see where this goes. I think it's just very early days.
Absolutely, and smart contracts on blockchains as well, autonomous kind of little bits of code. Fantastic, thanks, Glenn. Claire?
I think that fundamentally we get what we put in. And so how do we educate people to the options and choices of the future? How do we work together? How do we collaborate? And I think that's a often used word for shoving, opinions down each other's throats. But how do we genuinely take enough time to figure out how we work together to change the course of events here? If we don't like what we have today and we want to imagine a better future, then we have to recognize that the technology here is the toolkit. How we use that toolkit depends what we build. And I would like to build things for good. I would like us to, as we bootstrap our way into this new ecosystem, I would like to ask some of the questions of equality. How do we promote better access to services for the people that need it the most? How do we level things? Imagine if you had a verifiable credential you could prove your identity with that was based upon your passport. Well, only some people can afford a passport or have need for one. What about those who don't? Could we have a normalized personal identity credential that might be issued by an authoritative source that might be bootstrapped through multiple entry points and yet trusted in the same way? If you trust me enough to put me in prison and lock me up, do you not know who I am well enough to issue me with a personal identity credential at the end of that is not necessarily related to the time that I've spent in the prison system? I think there's huge opportunities for us to think differently about how we bootstrap ecosystems, what ecosystems represent, and how those values are reflected in the implementations of these tools. So I think those are the things that matter. They're the things that matter to me.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Carol?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Glenn and Claire said. And I think kind of the charge that my team thinks about a lot is that we got interested in this technology from more of the philosophical self-sovereign identity movement. And so I would charge any company kind of shifting to a B2B business model to still think about how, when you implement those solutions and deploy these technologies, you're still recognizing and keep retaining those values, because ultimately, especially here in the United States, a lot of that is what trickles down to the B2C world and ultimately will be what the individual users are facing. And then from kind of one plug I wanted to mention regarding the COVID case in particular is every business case for this technology has different incentives, incentive structures, different access actors involved in it. And I believe it was Harvard put out a really interesting white paper around COVID credentials that walks through the ethics. It was called COVID credentials. If we must do them, we must do them right. And it kind of talks through each of those actors and the various incentives and the risks of exclusion, for instance. So I think when we think about building a more equitable future, all of those pieces are going to be a little bit different by use case, and the technology can power an evil or a good future. And so I think it's on us, regardless of who you're selling it to consider those things when you deploy.
Amazing, guys. Thank you very much indeed. That was a great summary from everyone. So Carl Fowler from Transmute, Claire Barber from Matter, M-A-T-T-R, and Glenn Gore from Affinity. Guys, thank you very much for joining me on the panel. It's been a blast.
Thank you.
Thank you.